Hello, hello, hello. Hi, Reza. How are you?
Good, Shay. How are you doing?
I am doing well today. I'm doing well today. It is episode 12 of Future Forward.
Yeah, I'm excited about this one today, as I'm excited every week. So tell us what we're
Yeah.
talking about today, Shay.
Yes, today we will be talking about the future of disasters in cities. But before we dive into it, Reza, will you tell our audience, old and new, what this is?
Yeah. So Future Forward is a conversation that Shay and I have been having for years. We are bringing in you into this conversation, and it's really about cities. We talk about the past, the present, and the future, sustainable cities and thriving communities. And we select topics that we dive into to explore how we can think about strategic foresight on where cities can go with these particular topics. We always say that we're not the experts, and so we want you as our listeners to engage and tell us things that we don't know and share ideas that we haven't heard about yet. And I'm excited about this one today. So Shay, there was something that triggered you deciding that this would be a good topic for today.
Well, today it really came about. The episode today came about because of the fires in California.
Yeah.
I was chatting with a friend, and he mentioned he's in Colorado, but they're struggling with some of the fires, the smoke, and shared a little bit of data about how bad the fires are. And I thought, we've seen this before. I've written articles about fires in California and the resilience we need to build. And
Yeah.
so I thought, let us dive into it today. So
Yeah.
that's where it came from. Yeah.
That's great. So you had a really good example to get this started, which I think you were going to talk about Katrina in New Orleans as a a really eye-opening historical disaster that
Yeah.
really wasn't handled well. I mean, that's an
Yeah.
understatement.
It's an understatement, but we're going to be sharing a particular story from the Katrina disaster. But before I dive into that, one of the big overarching themes that has come up in our conversations on Future Forward is around the fact that a lot of the environmental movements and the laws and the policy changes that we've seen in the US have come after disasters,
Mm,
environmental disasters, um, natural or man-made disasters like oil spills. They lead to something. And so even as we discuss the future of disasters in cities, the hope and the idea for us diving into this is that we can start to think about it from that. What will have to change post this California fire disaster? And you shared some really good ideas about what will change. So,
yeah.
but before we get there, I can share about the Katrina story here.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think the interesting point that we're going to explore is that sometimes disasters are a failure of imagination or a failure of action.
Yeah.
And maybe that's something to listen to as we talk through this episode.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Katrina story, we won't go into the details of Katrina. It was an emergency disaster situation that wasn't handled well by US authorities. But as I was mentioning to you before we jumped to recording, the first book I read on my Kindle,
Mm,
which tells you when I read it, was this book called Zeitoun,
mm,
written by Dave Eggers, and it's a nonfiction narrative that chronicles the experience of Abdulrahman Zeitoun, who was a Syrian American businessman who lived in New Orleans before Katrina. He
mhm,
moved away, obviously, after Katrina, but successful, had a contracting business, and his wife, Kathy Zeitoun, together they had 4 kids. And once they knew, like many other people in New Orleans, once they knew the hurricane Katrina was on the way, Abdurrahman Zeitoun agreed with his wife that she would move herself and their 4 kids to Baton Rouge. And he would stay behind to protect their property, finish boarding it up, and try to ensure that they could recover post the hurricane, essentially.
Yeah.
So he stays, his wife and kids go, and as things start to ease up, he takes his canoe and decides to go see what is going on in the neighborhood. The floods had risen up. I believe it got to the roof of their home. So he literally just had to put the canoe on the roof and just move into the neighborhood to try and see what was going on. As he was doing this, he found purpose, is the way he framed it in the book. There were neighbors who were stranded, and Abdulrahman Zeitoun became what the government wasn't at that point. He was rescuing his neighbors, rescuing their pets, getting them to places of safety, and reminding his community that they are a community despite the disaster.
Yeah.
I'll fast forward here because sadly, he found a few people to help him with the rescue and recovery. But then once the National Guard came in, they saw them as looters, arrested Abdulrahman and the other people, took them to maximum security prisons in, I believe, other parts of Louisiana, and initially in a Greyhound bus, if I remember correctly, and then into a maximum security prison. So he lost communication with his family, who were in Baton Rouge and worried because a hurricane had just happened. The beauty of this story, I'll say, apart from the fact that he'd become and reminded everyone of the community that existed post Katrina in their neighborhood, his wife and the neighbors he'd helped then rallied because they didn't hear from him, knew something was wrong, but figured out a way and got him out of the prison he was in spite of everything that had gone wrong and made this disaster even worse for Abdulrahman Zeitoun and his family. They still found a way to both help the community, and then the community came back to help him. His wife was the main force behind making sure he recovered. She showed the resilience that communities that survive disasters have to show, and highlighted a lot of the injustice that happened during Katrina, another topic that seems to show up a lot in disaster situations in the US in cities. And it's just a powerful narrative of the human impact you can have on your community and what you can get back, despite the systemic failures of the larger governmental entities there. So I'll stop there, but it was the first thing that came to my mind when we decided, you know what, let's talk about this episode, this topic on this episode.
Yeah, I love that. I love that story. I love the taking it down to an individual. Sometimes we see disasters as this, big thing and they're faceless, but you just gave face to the disaster, and you gave an example of how even, our perception of Katrina is so negative. Here's this beautiful story that illustrates why we as humans can be good to one another in the face of disaster.
Yes.
And it makes me think about it. This probably takes us back to when humans, first started evolving. I mean, we were out in the wild with threats constantly around us. And the only way that we survived well was by working together. We could never do it as individuals. And I'm sure that, people that were kind and helped one another were valued in that community. And we seem to have forgotten that as humans. I think this is the one challenge of cities that we'll explore as we go through this episode, is it depersonalizes that connection that you have with your community, your neighbors. A city feels faceless sometimes. Disasters feel faceless sometimes. So I love that you brought it down to an individual, because this is what is probably the most meaningful way that we could have an impact with disaster.
Yeah. Thank you. It was this conversation because and as you can imagine, we do some research before we jump on these podcasts. As I would research the disasters that have happened and in some cases led to to regulations or policy, there were no stories. It was kind of stark to me
Yeah.
that there were no stories. And then I remembered Abdulrahman Zeitoun and just the resilience in
Yes.
community that
Yes.
has kept us for this long, that
Yes.
I agree, we're losing in our cities now.
Yeah. Yeah. So bring us into, that's a good historical example. Bring us into today. I think you
Yeah.
mentioned that California fire disaster was the news item or the event that sparked this episode.
Yeah. So we're recording on the 4th of August. And as at yesterday, there have been a total of 4,700 and I think about 67 or so wildfires, which have burned a cumulative 777,128 acres of land. Is astonishingly horrible. And year to date, the number of wildfires and the number of acres burned are much higher than the 5-year average, with about just over 900 structures destroyed and one person killed, which it's one life too many.
Yeah. Gosh.
Period.
Yeah. It's tragic. It's almost, we have these wildfires constantly, and it's almost like we're becoming numb to it, which I
Yes.
think is.
Yes, we are. You'll dive into the laws shortly, but I believe the human condition of once you experience something so much, even as it creeps up in intensity,
Mhm.
you don't realize it because you're now numb to it, even
Yes.
as it worsens in intensity. And that's what we're seeing with these wildfires. Every
Yeah. Yeah. And even though it's worse, our sense of crisis and action diminishes because it's just
yes,
another one. It
it's
hasn't
just
affected
another
me.
one. Yeah, which cannot be. And without tooting our own horn, it actually ties to a few of the laws we've shared. And if you want to dive
Yeah.
into the two here,
So there two of our laws apply to this. The first one is climate resilience is an urban imperative. And what we write here is cities must adapt to climate change impacts while simultaneously working to mitigate their contributions to global warming. And this is based on research by Rosenzweig that that highlights the crucial role cities play in climate change adaptation and mitigation. What we know is that as an individual, your contribution to climate change is not as much, but it's all these other systems, large infrastructure systems, the energy systems, the water and wastewater systems, all of transportation systems that are creating, exacerbating the climate change crisis. And cities play a crucial role because of all its, because the amount of density and the amount of infrastructure systems that we have that contribute to climate change. And so it becomes increasingly important for cities to do something to mitigate,
yeah,
because they have to mitigate as well as adapt,
yeah,
because the impact of climate change on cities is even more magnified because of that density and because of all those critical infrastructure systems that are often quite centralized and
yes,
have very detrimental impact in ways that cannot be, you can't bounce back from it quickly. Like when we saw the Texas snowmageddon or the snowpocalypse, whatever we call it,
yes, yes,
2 years ago, where it was really difficult to recover because systems on a large scale, like the water system or the wastewater system, went offline or couldn't recover, or the centralized power plants couldn't recover from
yes,
it, and it exacerbated this crisis for a very large population that couldn't quickly recover. So I think it's critical for cities to pay attention and be a part of helping solve this.
absolutely. And then the second law, which
Yeah.
is one that the Zaitun story sort of points out a little bit, and we know was the narrative that came out of Katrina period. The second law that applies here is that social equity underpins urban sustainability. And the framing here is that equitable access to resources, opportunities, and services, especially during disasters, across all neighborhoods and demographics, is fundamental to creating sustainable and inclusive cities. And this comes from research done by Dempsey and a few other researchers here in 2011 that identified social equity as a key dimension of urban social sustainability. We mentioned this during one of our previous episodes, this law, and the same thing applies in disaster situations, because the consequence of neglecting this law is that it increases the negative impact of disasters on the communities that were underserved in the first place. And I believe we will, on the back end, when we hear stories of the California fires, my hope and desire is that it's not just the same playbook where the underserved are the ones that suffer the most in these times again.
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting follow-up to our episode last week about social equity. And this is, social equity after disasters is just as important as social equity and how you build out infrastructure and how you build your cities. So I think a really important one. If you don't address those underserved communities after a crisis, you leave them further behind probably. Or you continue to leave them behind.
You just continue to leave them behind. It's quite, again, the stark conditions post-disaster, post-emergency just exacerbate whatever it is that was there before. We saw that during the pandemic. The communities that were struggling before the pandemic struggled even more and are still feeling some of those impacts now. As much as we can start to engage the community. And I think we can move to the positive examples we have here of where things have happened. And I'll point to Paradise, Colorado. We have two examples, but Paradise, California, where the Camp Fire, which was in 2018, which was at the point the worst fire disaster we'd seen up until that point. Again, the story plays out again. But the community, the leadership established they did three things that made the disaster less catastrophic for their communities than it ended up being for some of the other examples we have shared and that you all listeners might know of. The city established a Building Resiliency Center, which was a single location for owners of property to get assistance with rebuilding, which, again, space, a location for people to come essentially gather beyond just getting support. It became a center of meeting their needs for resilience building, for recovery, but also just to be with other people is what I found as I was reading about this online. A huge thing they did that adapts to, or addresses the second law we just shared was that low to moderate income residents who didn't own homes, because that first example was for people who owned homes and needed to rebuild. The second thing the city did was engage low to moderate income residents to relocate, rebuild, or navigate the options they had for support from the city for renters. They provided for those who had and also created options for those who didn't have, including national and state funding that did not just go to homeowners.
I think that's a really great example. I love that you picked a positive example of finding a way to recover from a disaster, from a wildfire, and that there was a focus on recovery community, as well as the underserved part of that town. Past week, I've been reading Deb Chatra's book that we've mentioned, how
Yeah.
infrastructure works. And in it, I love this book, and,
Have
we're
your
going to have her
copy.
on the show
Yes.
very soon. She talks about civic agency. And I love that phrase, because this is, how do you give everyone in a civic body agency to participate? And
Yeah.
what Paradise, California did is they created a space where that participation could occur, and everyone in that town had agency after the disaster.
Yes, absolutely. Civic agency, I'll tie it to the second example too.
Yeah.
It's a fantastic example, because a fantastic phrase, because the second example, Lyons, Colorado, this was floods that happened, small town, population of just over 2,000 in Colorado, recovering from flood. There was a church, Paradise Alliance Church, I believe it was called, which started this community dinner initiative, which was gatherings of people from different communities to foster a sense of unity post flood, to reunite people, because some people had to relocate because of the flood. So having these dinners at these community dinners at Paradise Alliance Church could allow neighbors who'd moved away to come back and engage with their old neighbors and start to build resilience again. And the plan was for these community dinners to last 6 months, but it ended up, and it's been going on for 3 years now, apparently. It went on for 3 years after the disaster, and it was this shared purpose that then helped each member of the community to sort of regain. And the dinners would involve people learning how to apply for grants, apply for whatever it was, to aid their recovery. Back to your civic agency point.
Yeah. That's a fantastic example as well. Like, again, creating a space, people come together. You can imagine how traumatic it is after disasters. Like, what do I do? Like, you're just trying to survive. And there's all this bureaucratic stuff that needs to happen, which might be extremely difficult for some people to tackle, given their state or access, and having others that you're sharing this burden with to help you and help everyone move forward together. I mean, what a great idea. Break bread together. I mean, it's amazing. They thought they were going to do this for 6 months, but it went on for 3 years, which tells you a lot about how much time it takes to fully recover from a disaster like that. It's not over. Like, it will be out of the news in a few weeks. But that community has to live with that disaster for years. The rebuilding doesn't, those cities, those communities, those towns took years to build, were destroyed and it will take many years for them to recover. So that's a very good example of how it can be done positively. I love those two.
Yeah. And you're touching on a big thing, which actually ties to another one of our laws that we didn't mention here, the idea that social infrastructure is almost as important as physical infrastructure.
Yes.
And in the recovery post-disaster, in both examples, in all three examples, honestly, the thing that happens, the thing that we point to as not happening is that, we're not rebuilding the physical infrastructure.
Yes.
And we forget the social infrastructure that is as critical to rebuild.
That's an amazing point, Shay. I think it's spot on. Again, Chatra's book, she talks about the word infrastructure, and infra means underneath or hidden. And so it's all these structures that we just believe exist, but they work. You turn on the lights come on, and it's invisible how that happens, but they're really, really critical. But we can imagine that physical infrastructure has systems and physics, the laws of physics, but social infrastructure is even more hidden and invisible and so easily forgotten and so hard to create or build or rebuild. I think we need to do an episode on social infrastructure. This is, I think,
We should. I
yeah,
agree. I agree. This actually touches on the first point you mentioned before we started recording, which is about how the lessons we should take to building resilience and recovery in the future when our cities experience disasters.
yeah. Yeah, what I noticed with the two examples of Paradise, California, and Lyons, Colorado, is small towns, tight communities, a very local way of recovering. And what happens with cities, again, we mentioned how cities can be depersonalizing. We forget that we're neighbors, we forget that we're communities. Cities almost make you feel anonymous, and that's one benefit of being in a city, but it's also downside of being in a
Yes.
city is that when a disaster occurs, it seems like this faceless thing. And your example of Zeitoun was a way of personalizing that recovery. And what seems to happen with disasters is disaster recovery is seen as a centralized initiative, when in cities probably should replicate what these towns are successful at doing by creating more localized places or communities for recovery, creating pods where that recovery can happen on a more local level so that a community can help one another recover, as opposed to wait for some central authority to come in and help you.
Yes, I 100% agree. And for anyone who knows about systems, resilience is built or resilience is improved when you have more points of failure, such that when one node in the system fails, the others can continue to function. While the approach we've taken with disaster recoveries that you're pointing out is not working and won't work for the future, is this centralized single point of failure, such that when it fails, the impact is a cascading one across the whole system. And I 100% agree. It has to be that. And again, for our listeners, we're not bashing the government that addresses these issues. We will need in the future, this is one of the things we've highlighted, in the future of disaster recovery, we will need improved decision making using data and technology by the centralized authorities or the entities in the cities. We're just suggesting that there is a big part of resilience or recovery that is tied to enhancing the community fabric that will be on the ground addressing the disasters as it happens and after it happens.
Yeah. That's good. What else, Shay? What else should we be thinking about the future? What other points?
Yeah, I think we'll touch on two quickly, and one is just the most of you, our listeners, will know of the 911 service, which is the emergency communication system. What we will have to add to that is just include, and right now you can text 911, but just the multimodal forms of communication that exist now, texts, video, images, as much as we can incorporate that into the communication system, the emergency communication system, because right now you can text or call. And then you have to describe what is happening for the most part. Why don't you just, we all have our phones. It can be asynchronous. You can take the video, send it to that number, and in the aggregation of these emergency calls, in the emergency situation, centralized government body that is in charge can make better decisions about how to help the communities post the emergency. And we don't have that yet. So I believe that'll increase the likelihood of things getting addressed with a bit more efficiency in the future. And then the last one, we always come back to this, the regulatory frameworks that exist. We have to embed equity in the policies for disaster recovery. which is the point you were making about just the pods of recovery. As much as we can enable our recovery and emergency management systems to help the underserved so that no one is left behind,
Yeah.
it will have to improve. And I'm sure you have a comment about that for sure.
Yeah, I think that's really critical. I think this is the part that is often forgotten in disaster recovery, is that it's a lot easier for communities that are served well to recover because they have a lot more resources. But a disaster will have a much higher impact on an underserved community because they just don't have as many resources to, they can be forgotten, they can be left behind. Having an eye on ensuring that is paid attention to, so that a recovery can, make them bounce back to a better place.
Yes.
And we know that social equity is good for cities, and so we can use that as that disaster as an opportunity to put that community in a better place, and the city therefore in a better place. Yeah, the last point that I mentioned at the start, like disasters are a failure of imagination or a failure of action and preparation, and it's really difficult. Disasters will happen, infrastructure will fail, and there are sort of thoughts and plans about what can be done in a disaster. I hope that each of you as individuals, think about your role in disaster recovery, but your role in your community in helping your community recover, and asking your local politicians or your local, whoever helps, govern your area, to be thoughtful about how to bring a community together for disaster recovery.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point, and I don't have the research reference at hand, but read something that suggested that communities that are sort of bonded, that have a community bond, are the most resilient in times of disaster.
That's great.
Period.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect closer.
Exactly. So we've come to the end of the episode, but we have a couple of mailbags, I believe, Reza. Yeah. Please go.
Yeah. So my mailbag is from my friend Mark. We were out, as we always are, on Sunday morning on our bike ride, and he listened to the Parks and Public Places episode. And if you remember, I mentioned Mark on that episode, and he really enjoyed it. He said that it was very balanced. We did a good job of representing what's happening in parks today, and I took that as a compliment, because he's an expert on it, because he's actually deeply involved in parks. In fact, he mentioned this morning that he's meeting with the city auditor next week to talk about one of those parks nonprofits that are not doing the city right. And so
that's great.
He still is doing the good work, and I appreciate him for it.
That's
what about
fantastic.
You, Seyi?
Yes, I have a short mailbag as well from my dear friend Marcelo Lando. Went to business school together. He's built his career in the energy space, and he listened to the podcasts as well, and commented on regulations episode, where he wonders if we can regulate the emission of CO better than we currently do, is maybe the best way to approach it, to think about it. And I will be having further conversations with Marcelo about this, because I do think there's a gem of an idea that we can pull a thread on in some future episode.
Yeah. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you. And so that's the end of the episode. We thank you for listening. As always, share with someone you think will enjoy it. Reach out. Anything we've said that sparks an idea, or anything you think we might need some correction on as we've shared, please continue to support, like, share, and be kind to one another, I think, is a piece of advice that popped into my head right now, and I thought to share.
I love that way to close the episode. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Seyi. We'll see you in a week.
Bye.
Bye.